Greg Flanagan was the kind of man who left very little behind him when he traveled. Years of living out of hotels had taught him how to keep his world small and orderly. He never unpacked completely. His rolling suitcase stayed open on the floor, used like a drawer. Clean shirts hung neatly in the closet. Dirty clothes were dropped in a single pile on the carpet. His toiletries lived in a folding cloth case that hooked onto the bathroom towel rack. Nothing fancy, nothing excessive, just habits repeated until they became automatic. At the end of each day, Greg followed the same quiet ritual. He slid off his worn brown leather boots and lined them up beside the suitcase. His faded jeans fell to the floor where he stood. He pulled on lightweight cotton pajama bottoms and settled in for the night. Most evenings, he didn't go anywhere. He didn't drink downstairs. He didn't wander the city. He stayed in. That Wednesday night was no different. Greg turned the air conditioner down low. He liked the room cold and sat back on the bed, leaning into two pillows propped against the headboard. To avoid staining the bedspread, he laid a clean white hand towel across it, arranging his belongings with care. An ashtray, a pack of cigarettes, a lighter, his BlackBerry, the TV remote, and a candy bar. He smoked. He broke off pieces of candy. He sipped root beer, and he watched television. It was Wednesday, September 15th, 2010. Room 348. The MCM Elegante Hotel, Beaumont, Texas. On the screen, Iron Man 2 played through its familiar sequence of computer-generated battles and explosions. Greg lounged there, alone, as he so often was. At some point during the loud, chaotic climax of the movie, amid all that fake violence, something very real entered the room. Greg never saw the ending. What happened next didn't announce itself. There was no crash, no scream, no sound that anyone remembers hearing. But whatever struck him came with sudden, overwhelming force. A blow so violent it would have blinded a man with pain. Greg managed to rise from the bed. He moved toward the door. He didn't make it far. He collapsed face first onto the green carpet, legs splayed beneath him. By the time his face touched the rug, he was almost certainly already dead. The next morning, the silence became noticeable. Greg's wife, Susie, called his office. They spoke every morning. That was their routine. But this time, he didn't answer. His phone went unanswered. When Greg failed to arrive at work, two coworkers drove to the hotel. They knocked on the door to room 348. No answer. The hotel manager unlocked it. Inside, they found Greg lying on the rug, prone and folded over. His skin had taken on a grayish-blue color. The room was stuffy and unusually warm. A spent cigarette rested delicately between two stiff fingers of his left hand, as if he had simply paused mid-motion. An ambulance was called, then the police. When Detective Scott Apple arrived a little over an hour later, the scene did not demand attention. There was no sign of forced entry. No overturned furniture. No visible blood. Greg's wallet was still in his back pocket, thick with $100 bills. Robbery didn't make sense. Guests in neighboring rooms reported hearing nothing unusual during the night. To Apple, it looked like what he had seen countless times before. A middle-aged man. A hotel room. A sudden collapse. He told nearby guests it was probably a natural causes thing. Sad, but not suspicious. Greg had lived hard in quiet ways. He chain-smoked. He avoided doctors. He didn't exercise. It was easy to imagine his heart simply giving out. Detective Scott Apple returned to the beginning, where all good investigations eventually circle back. He talked to Susie Flanagan often. She was heartbroken, yes, but she was also furious. Furious that the man she loved could be reduced to a mystery. Furious that someone had taken him and left nothing behind but confusion. Susie adored Greg. That wasn't performative grief. It was woven into her story. She had been a singer in a rock band in her 20s when she first met him. Offbeat, warm, unapologetically herself. They married young, separated, lived whole other lives apart, and then found their way back to each other years later. When she finally called him again after that long separation, Greg's response hadn't been dramatic. It had been simple. "I've been waiting for you to call." They remarried. 15 years later, he was gone. Everyone Apple spoke to told him the same thing. Greg was decent. Greg was fair. Greg was liked. He wasn't the kind of man who collected grudges or enemies. At work, he was respected. In business, successful. In life, quiet. At the MCM Elegante, Greg barely intersected with anyone at all. He didn't drink at the bar. He didn't socialize in the lobby. He didn't bring people back to his room. He went upstairs early and stayed there until morning. This wasn't a man known for risky behavior. So this wasn't a drunken altercation. This wasn't jealousy. This wasn't rage spiraling out of control. Yet someone had inflicted extraordinary violence on him. Apple began looking for the smallest disruptions. Anything that broke routine. And there was one. Early in the evening on the night Greg died. He had been making microwave popcorn. Nothing unusual, except the circuit blew. The outage knocked out power not only in his room, but also in the room next door and the rooms directly below. Greg had done the polite thing. He called the front desk and admitted fault. A maintenance worker came up to reset the breaker. Even his family could accept that explanation. Greg had always said he wanted to go quickly, without hospitals or prolonged decline. If this was the end, at least it had been on his terms. The body was photographed, transported, filed away as routine. At the Jefferson County Medical Examiner's office, Dr. Tommy Brown began the autopsy. He had done this thousands of times before. He worked fast, methodical, efficient. 45 minutes was usually all he needed to tell a body's final story. At first, there was nothing remarkable. Greg was 55, Caucasian, decently fit, no obvious wounds, just a small abrasion on his cheek from hitting the carpet when he fell. Then Dr. Brown noticed something else. A small laceration, half an inch, on the scrotum, swelling, discoloration, bruising spreading upward into the groin and across the hip. It wasn't consistent with a fall. Brown continued, and as he opened the torso, the story changed completely. There was far too much blood inside the body. Organs showed damage that shouldn't exist without a serious external event. The intestines were torn. The stomach and liver were lacerated. 2 ribs were broken. The heart itself ruptured. This wasn't the body of a man who had simply collapsed. This was the body of a man who had suffered massive trauma. The kind of trauma usually seen in violent crashes or crushing force. When Dr. Brown filled out the final line on the report, he did not hesitate. Under manner of death, he wrote a single word: homicide. And suddenly, the quiet room at the MCM Elegante wasn't quiet anymore. Because if Greg Flanagan had been beaten to death inside room 348, then someone had done it without leaving a trace. There was one question that refused to move, no matter how hard investigators pushed at it. Why? Why would anyone want Greg Flanagan dead? That visit cracked open 2 possible paths. The first was disturbing. The maintenance worker had a criminal record. He was a registered sex offender. Greg had suffered a strange wound, one that made no sense in the context of a collapse or a fight. Could this have been some kind of bizarre assault? Something sexual? Something hidden? Apple explored it carefully, thoroughly. He spoke with the man, dug through his history, watched his behavior. Nothing emerged. No opportunity. No evidence. No link. The theory stalled where it began, built on suspicion, unsupported by facts. The second theory involved the room next door. Room 349. A group of union electricians were staying at the hotel for an extended job. At night, they drank together, moved from room to room, laughed, talked, loud enough that people noticed, but not loud enough to trigger complaints. When the power went out, it would have affected them. What if one of them knocked on Greg's door? What if someone was drunk, irritated, aggressive? What if words were exchanged? What if something happened in the hallway? It was plausible. Not proven, but plausible. Some of the electricians had been questioned the day Greg's body was found. None admitted to any interaction with him. No arguments. No fights. Nothing. 9 days later, Apple returned. This time, he wore a hidden camera. He and another officer went door to door on the 3rd floor of the Cabana wing. The men they encountered were cooperative, curious, calm. In room 349, they met Lance Mueller and his roommate, Tim Steinmetz. Blue jeans, T-shirts, normal men on a work trip. What happened to that guy anyway? Mueller asked. Apple answered honestly. He didn't know. He He explained the injuries, said it was almost like something heavy had fallen on Greg. Mulla found it. There's nothing in these rooms heavy enough, he said. At first, the idea went nowhere. But when the investigation appeared to be drifting toward the cold files, the name came back. If you want to do something, the lawyer urged Susie, you got to call this guy. So she did. Brennan wasn't hard to find. People with unresolved grief found him constantly. He listened carefully. He asked hard questions. And when he agreed to take a case, it wasn't because he wanted attention. It was because something about it bothered him. Greg Flanagan's death bothered him. Not just because it was violent, but because it didn't behave like violence. Brennan came to Lafayette in April. The first person he worked was Susie. Not gently, not superficially. He asked about the marriage, about fidelity, about money, about insurance. He pushed until he was satisfied that grief wasn't hiding something darker. Then he asked one last question. Was there anything about the crime scene that didn't feel right to you? Susie didn't hesitate. The room was warm, she said. Her husband hated warm rooms. That detail followed Brennan home. When he returned to Beaumont, he met Apple late at a sports bar. The two men ate, talked, and sized each other up. Brennan laid down his rule immediately. No freelancing, no surprises, no undermining authority. Apple respected that, and the next morning, Brennan asked to see everything. The photos, the reports, the autopsy, the room. He listened as Apple walked him through 7 months of dead ends. And when Apple finished, Brennan said something that stopped the conversation cold. I think I know how this guy died. I think I know when he died. I think I know who killed him. And I think I know how we're going to catch him. Apple laughed. Then Brennan asked to borrow Susie's phone number. The question he asked her sounded trivial. Was Greg right-handed? Yes. And when he smoked, which hand? The right. Always. That was enough. Brennan explained it slowly. The power outage. The breaker. The air conditioner shutting off. The timeline locked Greg alive at 8:30 p.m. After that, the room warmed quickly. Too quickly for someone who liked it cold. Then there was the cigarette. That small, careful detail. If Greg had been beaten somewhere else and returned to the room, someone would have had to place that cigarette back in his hand. Light it. Arrange it delicately. That made no sense. More importantly, a man with a ruptured heart does not calmly return to his bed, light his cigarette, and then collapse. So Greg had lit it himself. But if he smoked with his right hand, why was the cigarette found in his left? Because, Brennan reasoned, Greg had gotten up, moved toward the door, shifted the cigarette to free his right hand, which meant he was alive, conscious, calm, seconds before he died. That realization redirected everything. The electricians were next door. Their power went out too. If anyone confronted Greg, it would have been then. Not in the room, in the doorway. Apple admitted he had spoken to them. They were nice, he said. Brennan didn't argue. He just nodded. People talked, he said, especially when drinking. Someone always knows something. They spoke to Dr. Brown next. Brennan wanted to know if a beating could explain the injuries. Brown said yes, especially if steel-toed boots were involved. That fit, but Brennan wasn't convinced. He returned to the hotel footage. Hours of people coming and going. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. When Brennan came back again in May, the electricians were gone, but their co-workers remained. Brennan believed that secrets leaked. The human nature guaranteed it. They went door to door. Nothing. Until one man mentioned a gun. Not clearly. Not confidently. Just enough to register. As they drove away, Brennan said something that caught Apple off guard. We need to go back to the hotel. For what? To look for a bullet. They searched room 348 on their hands and knees. Furniture. Walls. Nothing. They were about to stop when Brennan noticed something that shouldn't have mattered. A patched indentation near the door. It didn't line up. On the other side, in room 349, the patch wasn't an indentation. It was a hole. Small. Neat. Filled with dried toothpaste. The trajectory ran straight through the wall and directly to the bed. Greg's bed. The place where he had been sitting. Smoking. Watching his movie. Brennan stood there quietly. This motherfucker was shot. The medical examiner didn't want to hear it until the photos came out. until the damage lined up, until the heart photo surfaced. And finally, after a long silence, Dr. Brown looked again. "Yeah," he said, "that's a bullet hole." And with that, the case of room 348 changed forever. By the time the detectives showed up in Wisconsin, Tim Steinmetz had probably convinced himself the worst had passed. 7 months earlier, he and Lance Mueller had left Beaumont and gone back to their lives. The job was over. The hotel was behind them. The death in the next room had become a story they didn't tell, a memory they tried to sand down with time. Then 2 Texas investigators came all the way north to sit across from him in an interview room at the Chippewa County Sheriff's Department. That alone changes the temperature in a man's chest. Steinmetz had time to worry, time to call Mueller, time to rehearse. Their stories matched. Their wording lined up. They'd already decided what could be said and what could never be said. In the room, everything felt professional, calm, almost friendly. Steinmetz sat in a swivel chair at one end of a heavy wooden table. The detectives sat opposite with notebooks open, files on the table, the look of men doing routine work. Kim Brennan was there, big, white hair combed up, eyes that didn't drift. Scott Apple sat beside him, quieter, watchful. They thanked Steinmetz for coming in, told him it was routine, walked him slowly through the timeline. Where were you that night? Who was with you? When did you return to the room? Did you hear anything next door? Steinmetz answered carefully, dutifully. He remembered small things. He supplied details. He played the role of helpful witness. The only part he left out was the one that mattered. And the detectives didn't push. That's what made it worse. Because when someone is guilty, truly guilty, silence from the other side can feel like a trap you can't see. You heard the guy next door died? Brennan asked. We did hear that, Steinmetz said. But we really didn't know for sure what the hell was going on. We had no idea. We didn't hear no commotion next door. No banging. No nothing. That's why this is kind of weird. He said it like a man repeating a line he'd already said before, like someone who had practiced it. Brennan and Apple took notes. Then Apple wrote it up as a formal statement. That's it, huh? Steinmetz asked. That's it, Apple said. Steinmetz exhaled, almost laughed. You guys flew all the way here for that? Brennan asked him to read the statement out loud and correct anything inaccurate. Steinmetz did. He changed a small detail, apprentice to journeyman. He initialed his edits. A local officer came in and notarized it right there. This is the moment most people don't understand. A notarized statement isn't just paper. It's a door closing. Steinmetz stood up, ready to leave, the pressure draining out of him like a slow leak. Is that it? He asked again. Brennan didn't smile. Hang on a second, he said. His tone changed, sharpened. No more friendliness. It was, Brennan said, until you sign that statement. Now you've got a problem. Steinmetz froze. Okay, he said, startled, and sat back down. Now tell us what really happened, Brennan said. Because we know what happened. And now you're going to jail with him. Do you want to go to jail with Lance? Steinmetz blinked like he'd misheard. Why am I going to go to jail with Lance? You just made a false police report, Brennan said. That's why. Apple leaned in, voice softer, almost sympathetic. Tim, we know what happened. We know everything that happened down there. And I realize you're trying to be noble and protect a friend, but you are about to get your whole family in a bind, and it's not worth it. That was the crack. Because Steinmetz wasn't a hardened criminal. He was a man who'd carried something heavy for 7 months, hoping it would never fall out of his hands. And now 2 men from Texas were telling him it already had. Just tell us, Brennan said. Tell us what happened. And Steinmetz did. What came out wasn't a neat confession. It was a spill. Beer. A bottle of whiskey. A 9mm Ruger pistol brought up from the car. Mueller took it out, Steinmetz said, and started playing with it, pointing it, joking like people joke when they're drunk and stupid and trying to impress someone. Steinmetz cursed at him, dropped to the floor at one point. Pano, another electrician, thought he'd been hit. Then the gun went off. Not a bang in the distance. Not a sound you could mistake. A gunshot in a hotel room. Pano turned and saw a hole in the wall. Mueller panicked, bundled the gun, took it back to his car, returned. Pano left disgusted. Mueller and Steinmetz went downstairs and kept drinking. Then Steinmetz offered the part he'd been using to protect himself from the truth. Later, after midnight, he said he heard coughing next door, meaning someone was alive. It didn't matter. Either way, they didn't knock. They didn't check. They didn't call for help. And the next morning, when police were outside room 348 and a body was being rolled out, Steinmetz admitted what he'd thought in that moment. I thought he killed that guy. The detectives weren't done. They had Steinmetz dial Mueller. They recorded the call. And when Steinmetz told him, plainly, that he'd finally told the truth, there was a silence on the other end of the line, so long it sounded like a man watching his life collapse in real time. By the time Lance Mueller finally understood what had happened, it was already far too late. For months, he had lived inside a carefully constructed lie. A lie reinforced by silence, by assumptions, by an autopsy that seemed to absolve him. He had convinced himself that the gunshot and the death in room 348 were unrelated events. Tragic, yes, but separate. The story in the news had helped. The coroner's report had helped even more. There was no bullet, they said. No Gunschädigung. No homicide by firearm. So Mueller did what people often do when the truth threatens to destroy them. He chose the version of reality that allowed him to sleep. That illusion shattered the moment Tim Steinmetz told him the truth over the phone. The guy, Steinmetz said quietly now, he died from the gunshot. Mueller refused to believe it. He couldn't. He cycled through disbelief, denial, anger. Each one grasped desperately, discarded just as fast. If that was true, he said, they would have said something on the news. But reality doesn't require permission to exist. Later that night, Mueller called Ken Brennan himself. He was drunk, disoriented, trying to explain his way out of a corner that no longer had an exit. Brennan cut him off. "You're drunk," he said flatly. "Call your attorney." That was the last moment Mueller had to speak freely. 2 years later, on October 29, 2012, everyone who had carried this case walked into a courtroom in Beaumont, Texas. Susie Flanagan sat there. Scott Apple sat there. Greg's family and friends sat there. Ken Brennan flew in to be there, too. Not as a hero, not as a showman, but because he believed that if you take a case seriously, you see it through to the end. Lance Mueller had entered a no-contest plea to manslaughter. As the judge began reading the sentence, Brennan felt his stomach tighten. The judge opened by calling the incident a tragedy. An accident. Brennan's mind raced. This can't end like this. But then the tone changed. The judge began listing decisions. Not one mistake. Not one moment of bad luck. A sequence. The decision to bring a gun into another state. The decision to drink heavily. The decision to play with a loaded firearm. The decision not to knock on the door next door. The decision to hide the gun. The decision to patch the wall with toothpaste. The decision to say nothing again and again. This wasn't fate. It was willful irresponsibility stacked on top of itself. Mueller was sentenced to 10 years in prison, half the maximum allowed by law. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't symbolic. It was accountability. Too late to save Greg, but not too late to name what had happened.